they lack the kind of engagement that we need. I think the turnout today shows that on this occasion my friend was wrong. It's very good to see such a strong attendance and such a clear presence of youth and young people in the audience today. So thank you so much for coming for this. Now I am, as Jack said, an anthropologist and a sociologist, which means that I study people, not nature. So when I eventually will say something about the environmental impact of unsustainable development in Goa, I don't speak as a biologist, I don't speak as a zoologist who knows in detail how nature works. I speak as someone who knows more about people than about nature. But because this thing that we call development is very fundamentally about how we as human beings think about the good life, the kind of life that we as human beings want to live. I think it's useful also to have that social science perspective on sustainable development discussions. But let me start with myself a little bit. Why am I here? Well, I think in life, if we're fortunate, we get to move around, we get to travel, and it sometimes happens that you come across a place that you fall in love with, almost by chance, or without meaning to do so. And I think that's what happened to me when I first came to Goa. I think this was 2007. And I've come back many times since. I usually come not to talk, but to listen and to learn. So I think, in a sense, my rightful place to be today would have been in the audience with you, listening to the rest of the outstanding panel that we have with us today. I told this to Jack when he first contacted me. Goa speaks for itself. Goa has a strong, powerful voice. I should be the one listening, not talking. But Jack is a very persuasive personality, and I thank you for that, because in the end I accepted the kind invitation to also say something here. So since then, I think the same kind of falling in love with Goa has happened with my wife and also with my kids who are with me on this visit as well. Experiencing Goa's natural beauty, its richness and diversity, and not least its social friendliness, and I would dare to say very strong sense of civic engagement. There is much that Goa is blessed with, and which makes it attractive to so very many people. The only flip side might be that this very attractiveness may also end up being a challenge if it's not handled extremely well. But let me continue with an anecdote. When me and my family came here last time, this was 2 years ago, we landed in the middle of the night in the Napoli airport. And from there we were going to take a taxi to our hotel. And along the way we passed this extremely beautiful old house in what they call the Indo-Portuguese style, on a fairly large plot of land. And right outside the entrance gate to that plot of land was a sign the owner had put up saying, "This property is not for sale." My son, who was in the car, was 10 years old at the time, and he asked me, "Daddy, what does this sign mean?" And I was a little puzzled because his English was good enough to read and understand the sign. So I was puzzled. What is it you don't understand? It simply means that whoever owns this house and this land is not interested in selling it. And that upset my son a little bit. He said, "Dad, my English is good enough. I know what it says on the sign. But what does it mean at home? If we want to sell something, we put up a sign saying, 'This house is for sale.' Why would you put up a sign if you're not going to sell anything? Why would anyone want that kind of information?" And I think sometimes the naive eyes of an outsider child can be quite illuminating. So I think what my son has somehow noticed was how intensely commodified so many things in Goa are becoming. To the extent that some people might assume that everything here is somehow for sale, if only the price is right. Land, a house, air, water, trees, forests. Perhaps this sense has become so strong that if you have something you value, your land, your family house, that you don't want to part with, you actually have to make a public statement to that effect. And indeed, I think the question of land, what to do with it, to buy it, to sell it, what to do with it, is actually central to the whole discussion of what sustainable development can mean. The question of how do we use land, for what purposes, for whose benefit. These are essentially questions that development is fundamentally about. And the famous American author Mark Twain, back in the 1800s, he was asked about investment advice. What would he recommend that people do with their money to make a good investment? And he is believed to have answered, "You should buy land because they're not making it anymore." That was his investment advice. Buy land, they're not making it anymore. And it's easy to smile and laugh at this sentence. They're not making it anymore. Of course they aren't. We were never making land in the first place. But I think there's a kind of deep philosophical truth to this statement by Mark Twain. That all the things we usually think about as commodities, the things we buy and sell on a daily basis, almost all of them are somehow produced by human labor. The clothes we wear, the watch on our wrist, the furniture we sit on, the plastic chairs, the motorbikes outside, and so on. All of these are a combination of some raw materials, some machines, human labor, and from that we get commodities that we can buy and sell in the market. But the land we stand on, the land on which we put our houses, that's not made by anyone. It's not produced by human labor. In a sense, it's just there. We can say it's part of nature. It's where we dwell. It is what sustains our lives. Just like air and water, which are also not produced by human labor, but which are, in a sense, part of the life-sustaining nature itself. And in very many cultures and places around the world, the idea that you can treat land just like any other property, that you can buy and sell on a market, and that you can privatize it and exclude others from it, is a very strange idea. There's one very famous conversation also from India, from the Chotanagpur district, roughly 100 years ago, when the British colonizers came to that part of India to take over Adivasi lands. And one day the tax collector comes to the Adivasi communities and say, "You have fallen into debt, you owe money to this person, because of that we are now taking your land away from you, we are buying it from you, taking it away." And to that statement, the local Adivasis are believed to have said, "Well, When a man buys a mat, he rolls it up and he takes it away. If this person has bought my land, let him roll it up and take it away. If he can't do it, then it remains mine. So there's nothing natural about the idea that land should be a commodity or something that we can freely buy and sell in the market. Yet, ironically, land is probably the most desired property in Goa today, as indeed in many other parts of India, with many actors, many institutions, many organizations trying to control it, appropriate it, put it to different uses for different kinds of financial gain. And of course, the environmental consequences of all of this are, I'm sure, well known to everyone in this room. But let me just go through some of these quite quickly, in any case, that we also discuss in greater length in the book that Jack mentioned early on. If we look to the hinterlands, the priceless Western Ghats that we know, and its surrounding areas, has been the site of extensive mining operations for many years, until it was stopped first around 2012, if I remember correctly. From very early on, it was observed how mining was unscientific, wastefully conducted, and that negative environmental consequences have been visible from a very early stage. Partly because it's carried out through what is called open cast or strip mining, which has been called one of the most destructive forms of industrial activity anywhere. If we go back 20 years, I think Goa had not quite 10% of its area dedicated to mining, but quite close, roughly 8%. That's more than any other Indian state in terms of percentage. And even this figure might be an underestimation if we think about the many, many acres of land where mining has been carried out illegally or where mining overburden has been dumped. The damage has been considerable. Forests and ecosystems have been damaged, water bodies, natural water flows destroyed or disrupted, dumped overburden ending up in agricultural fields or elsewhere, making agriculture very difficult. This has been compounded by the red dust from mining that settles on fields and on plants, on animal and human bodies, and in lungs, of course. We have the trucks transporting iron ore away from the mines, disrupting village life, or the barges carrying the ore, creating waves large enough to disrupt undisturbed cultivation on Kasan lands. These are, as we know, or at least used to be, the most fertile lands in all of Goa, and are now also threatened partly by neglect, partly by simple landfilling, but also by the broader dynamics of global warming and sea level rise, to which Goa has contributed very little, but from which it may end up suffering disproportionately much, if not mitigated properly. Now that Goa is no longer a major hub for exporting iron ore, there are plans, as we know, for making it a major hub for importing another kind of mineral, namely coal. These plans have been around for many years, and they involve expanding coal handling operations at the port, possibly the dredging of the harbor, dredging of surrounding rivers, to allow bigger ships carrying more coal to come to Goa, threatening marine and river ecosystems, but also undermining the livelihoods of traditional fishing communities. We often focus on the bad effects of excavating and burning coal, and that's very important. But we also need to focus on the effects of moving coal from one place to another, either by train or by trucks, with lots of black dust settling on plants, in fields and gardens, on houses, blackening the water and blackening our lungs. Infrastructure development, I think, is another major driver of land and environmental challenges in Goa. The new Mopa airport, where I landed this time on my travel, is a good case in point. It's built, as we know, on a large laterite plateau in North Goa, plateaus of which Goa has several. It used to be, and I speak now in the past tense, quite a biodiversity hotspot, home to many flagship animal species, large, partly protected forests, a very, very large number of cashew trees growing in plantations around the slopes. And the plateau itself functioning almost as a giant sponge that would soak up water in the monsoon and release it gently throughout the year to sustain a large, wider ecosystem. That's now no longer there. And as we know, the airport was only, of course, part of the project. It's now linked with widened roads, with ambitious plans for setting up hotels and a large number of villas, transforming this entire part of Goa in one big stroke in ways that are going to be very difficult to reverse in the future if one has a change of mind. And then we have tourism and real estate development, about which much can be said and about which much is being said in the media continuously. We all know Goa as a tourism destination. That's the image of Goa I had growing up in the West, with hippie parents who knew something of the place from the old days. But I think increasingly many people see Goa also as a real estate destination, a place to have a second home away from home, even if it stands empty much of the year. Much has been said in recent months in connection with new plans for developing different kinds of mega resorts and apartments and real estate in different parts of Goa, whether in the coastal areas or more inland. The chosen locations are almost always eco-sensitive in one way or another and disturbing of local communities. Indeed, I think if there's one thing today that's driving the large-scale conversion of land away from more ecological uses, it would have to be real estate. Some major concerns, in addition, are the ways that such new villas or apartments are built. In concrete, in steel, often with very poor thermal qualities, which means that we have to have the air conditioner running 24/7 to be able to live inside these houses most of the year. But there's also the question of water resources. Hotels consume a lot of water, so do tourists, usually more than they do at home, as we know quite well. So we have groundwater extraction, and we have the water tankers doing the rounds in the morning, filling up the water stock. This is a very condensed narrative, and I think it's familiar, perhaps, to everyone here. And one can, of course, ask, in a setting such as this, is this what we would call sustainable development? Well, if we go by the classic definition of sustainable development as a kind of development that meets the needs of the present without jeopardizing the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, then I think the answer has to be no. The story here is rather one where much of the capital and much of the wealth that is continuously produced in Goa comes from the destruction of land and nature, and not from the careful use of it, as one of my fellow anthropologists observed already 25 years ago. And so it is easy to despair and to give up and to become inactive, which is ironic because Jack explicitly instructed me to be inspirational, and I think he too in his opening remarks stressed agency, the ability to inspire, to motivate action for change, for the better. So where do we look? Well, I can start by asking the question, how is it that someone like me, who doesn't live in Goa, and who has not regularly seen and witnessed these environmental changes going on all around, how is it that I can stand here and speak about this in some detail after all? Well, it's partly because much of these changes, they're well known, they're well understood. And because a lot of information about all of this is available in the public domain for those who are interested and for those who know where to look. And that's the case because of the hard, painstaking, but also courageous work that concerned Goan citizens, Goan NGOs, Goan organizations, Goan individuals and researchers have done over many decades, documenting in great detail the changes that are happening, building up an archive of knowledge and insight that is available for those who are interested, with dedication and conviction and the love they have for Goa. And I think this vibrancy of Goa's civil society and its concerned citizens that are here today surpasses almost anything I've come across in other parts of India. An enormous drive and enthusiasm and dedication that one can build on and draw from. If that's not an inspiration in its own right, I don't know what is. So my role is not here to tell anyone, and not least, not to tell Goa's youth what they should do and how they should go about it. That is for Goa to decide. That is for everyone in the audience to think about and to reflect on and to arrive at their own conclusions. I think we can say nostalgia might not do the trick. We might long for the good old days sometime, but it's even more important to try to imagine the good new days. What can the good new days be like? What is the kind of future we want to see? So if I am to offer just a few reflections as I approach the end of my talk, I think we can remember that the struggle for sustainable futures, it's not just a material struggle. It's not just a development struggle, and it's not just an environmental struggle. It's also a moral struggle, an ethical struggle, about how we want to relate to the nature and to the world around us. And I think in that context, it's interesting to note that over the past decade or so, all major religions in the world, and most minor religions too, have actively entered environmental discussions, formulating ethical but also moral arguments that may help guide us with a sense of broader or bigger purpose. This includes, as we know, the Church, with the encyclical letter, the Laudato Si', that has put environmentalism high on the agenda of the Church. But we also know this from world religions such as Islam, that has also undergone an environmental turn. And we know, of course, how leading proponents of Hinduism, both within India and abroad, have also stressed that what we call nature is not a dead matter, but a living being, teaching us that that which sustains all species of life and helps to maintain harmonious relationships among all living beings is something we need to cherish, nurture, and protect. And this is old wisdom that we also know from India's Adivasi communities, who have over millennia devised ways of engaging local environments in ways that are ecologically sustainable, protecting local ecosystem through practices evolved over time. So within this broad field, there's much here that I think allows us to formulate environmental care in a shared moral or ethical language, where we can perhaps all come together to get a shared moral compass that can allow us to act more sustainably in the present. To think about sustainable futures, I think also requires that we think about ways of working against the individualizing drive of our societies, which are global phenomena, and to find ways of working against the view of land or the environment as a resource or as property that we can own and from which we can squeeze out maximum profits. We might want to think about new ways of making things common rather than making things individually. Historically, what we call the commons or common property have existed in every society in the world, but they are diminishing, they are growing smaller, with not just common land being increasingly privatized, but also air and water being privatized. So we can look with optimism, I think, on the return to ecological and community farming that has become so popular in Goa in recent years. By the way, I was at the Goa Arts and Literature Festival roughly a week ago, and there was one of the authors who remarked that Goa is so green, if you take a seed and throw it into the air, it will sprout before it hits the ground. And I think that's a lovely image to carry around with oneself. All these farmers' clubs that have emerged in many places have seen local communities coming together, collaborating to return the land, to restore it, to keep it green, to keep it open, to keep it accessible. I've been fortunate enough to visit one or two in different parts of Goa, and I know there are very many. I think this is important because all these initiatives are trying to think about cultivation, agriculture, protection of the land, not as a kind of last resort of people to turn to if they couldn't get a job elsewhere, but rather as a kind of eco-stewardship, where concerns about the land, the nature and quality of the food we produce come together to produce outcomes that are good for the environment and that are good for the bodies who eat the food that come from this project. We can also look to organizations such as the one that is hosting us today, who insist on the kind of Goa that is being passed on to the next generation, thinking about intergenerational equity, that we have a concern or a moral, ethical duty to pass on what we hold in a condition that is no worse, but preferably better than what it is today. And we have the Goenchi Mati movement that thinks in very similar terms about Goa's mineral wealth, insisting that mineral and the environment, it's not something we inherit from the past. It's something we borrow from our children, and we have a duty to to returning to them in a better state. These are all, I think, inspiring ways of people as individuals, in small collectives, in bigger collectives, in institutions, or in loose organizational forms, trying to make nature and the environment something common. Something that we have a common responsibility for, but also attachment to, in small or bigger communities. We can make things common in all kinds of ways, and the only challenge is to be creative, original, imaginative, and determined. So when people come up and say, oh, well, there is no alternative to the way we're doing things today, don't believe them. Rest assured that there are many alternatives, and many of them already exist, waiting to be built on, waiting to be elaborated on, waiting to be expanded. So it's about starting to imagine, starting to dream, and eventually starting to act. With that, I thank you very much for your attention and greatly look forward to the rest of this magnificent event. Thank you.